In this video, I will be performing Fortune My Foe by Thomas Tomkins. With the exception of two transcriptions of lute pieces by John Dowland, I have been reluctant to record English repertory up to now, and I will explain later in the introduction why that is the case. For now, let's begin by looking at this particular piece. Tomkins wrote Fortune My Foe near the end of his life. To provide some context, he lived between 1572 and 1656, and the manuscript of Fortune My Foe is dated July 4th, 1654. Tomkins was certainly not the first composer to have been inspired by this popular tune. In addition to other English composers that used it, such as William Byrd and John Dowland, the tune was also disseminated in the continent. In the Netherlands, for instance, it appears under the title Engelse Fortuin and was used by composers such as Jan Pieterszoon Svelink. Tomkins's Fortune My Foe comprises a set of 8 variations. The way I hear it, I think the piece as a whole may be subdivided in 2 almost equal parts, with the first part consisting of variations 1 through 4, and the second part of variations 5 through 8. The reason I subdivide it in this way is because both parts seem to begin using predominantly slower rhythmic values and gradually build momentum by concentrating more and more on the fastest note value we encounter in this piece, which is the 16th note. Thus, if we were to look at the first variation, in other words, the very opening of the piece, we can see that we're mainly dealing, at least at the very beginning, with quarter notes, so that it sounds something like this. Now contrast the opening of the first variation with the opening of the fourth variation, which is the last variation in the first part that I mentioned before. And notice how much faster this is, how much more exuberant, and now we're basically dealing with 16th notes. And then, if we were going to go to the fifth variation, which is the one that opens the second part of the piece, we will see that we have once more a more subdued tone and slightly slower note values again. And again, what we're going to find is that as we're moving to the next variations, once again, we're gradually increasing the rhythmic intensity. Variation 8 has a couple of noteworthy features. First, it shares a pretty much identical opening gesture with variation 7, only here the accompanimental figure is more embellished so that there's more forward momentum. And let me show you the difference between those two. So here is the beginning of the 7th variation. And here's now the 8th variation. The second noteworthy feature of the 8th variation is that Tomkins concludes it, and therefore also concludes the piece as a whole, with a fairly extended coda. As I mentioned at the beginning of this introduction, I have been reluctant to record English repertory up to this point. There are basically two reasons for this: the choice of instrument and the realization of ornaments. In terms of choosing an appropriate instrument, it is important to keep in mind that the modern tendency to think of an instrument in a generic way becomes less and less valid the further we go back in time. Nowadays, for instance, we have one type of piano, whereas before the 20th century there were several different types, each based on different aesthetic principles. It's also important to keep in mind that composers wrote specifically for the instruments they knew, taking full advantage of their particular characteristics. There is plenty of evidence that musicians were fully aware that the distinctive capabilities of different instruments influenced both playing style as well as compositional choices. Regarding the differences between Viennese and English pianos, for instance, Friedrich Kalkbrenner wrote in 1831 that, quote, "The instruments of Vienna and those of London have resulted in two schools." A little over 20 years later, in 1853, Friedrich Wieck expressed a similar belief, writing that, quote, "Of great difference in playing and composition was the difference in pianos which both schools used, the variance between the Viennese and the English pianos." End quote. All of this also applies to harpsichord repertory, and it is something I always keep in mind when choosing the pieces I record for videos. Obviously, I cannot afford to have every type of harpsichord, and it goes without saying that a lot of the 17th century repertory I tend to perform was not exactly conceived with my 18th century instrument in mind, but depending on the particular repertory, a later instrument can still be close enough. I still have my doubts about whether my instrument is appropriate for English repertory in general, but after living with this particular piece for a while, I feel that it works quite well. When it comes to sets of variations, the temptation is to use different combinations of registers in order to differentiate each variation. And there is an argument to be made that if you do have an 18th century harpsichord, why not use its full capabilities? Now, I'm not trying to suggest that Tomkins would have only known instruments with a single 8-foot register, but for my performance, I decided to use the lower manual 8-foot register exclusively and create differentiations through phrasing and articulation. The second reason I have been reluctant to record English repertory concerns the realization of ornaments, and more specifically, how to interpret the ornament signs we find in English repertory of the 16th and 17th centuries. This is a complex topic, and there is no way to address all its facets in this video. However, here is a brief overview of the issue. The two predominant signs for ornaments we find in this repertory consist of either a single or a double stroke. Since Tomkins uses almost exclusively the double stroke in Fortune My Foe, let me show you for a moment a different piece that includes both signs so that you can get an idea of what they look like. This is John Bull's Melancholy Pavan, and I chose it simply because it contains a good number of these two ornament signs. As you can tell, the majority of the signs are double strokes, but there are 3 single strokes. The first one is in the alto line, the note C, in measure 5. The second one is in the second line of the score at the very, very beginning, the first measure, where once again in the alto line, the note A has a single stroke, and then the third one is in measure 10 on the soprano line, the high A. But with the exception of those three, what we have here are double strokes. The trouble is that there is not a consensus on what these two signs mean, or indeed whether each of the signs is supposed to denote only one particular ornament rather than implying the use of different ornaments depending on the context of a particular passage. There is evidence that the double stroke, also referred to as a shake in some contemporary sources, may primarily denote a trill, but it is still uncertain whether the trill is meant to be performed by starting on the note above, which arguably was the most common way in the late 17th and most of the 18th century, or starting on the principal note and alternating with a note above, a practice we find in earlier Italian repertory and which is also the way the trill came to be predominantly performed during the course of the 19th century. Or perhaps both ways are valid, depending on the context. Since there does not seem to be a clear answer, it is up to the performer to make a decision. However, before making a decision, it is important to understand the crucial difference between the two types of trill. Let me demonstrate by looking at a short passage from Fortune My Foe. More specifically, I want to look at the very beginning of the second variation. And what I want to do is, first of all, simply play the first measure without any trill. So we have this melody. And there is a double stroke sign on the note B, on this one. So what I'm going to do is, first I'm going to play it by starting on the note above. I'm going to play a trill starting on the note above. And if I do that, it sounds like this. Now, what is happening here, if I do this, what I'm doing in some respects is that I am delaying the arrival of the melodic note. In other words, what I'm doing is I'm introducing a wrinkle in the melodic fabric, because what we expect is this, but what I'm doing is I'm actually delaying the arrival of the note B. Now, if I were to start the trill on the principal note, in other words, on the note B itself, it would sound like this. And the difference here is that in this case, what I'm doing is actually confirming the melodic contour, because the note B happens exactly when I expect it to happen. So to me, this is a very crucial difference between the two types of trill. Starting from the note above denies the melodic contour, as I said, introduces a wrinkle in the melodic fabric, whereas starting on the principal note actually confirms the melodic contour. As I mentioned previously, when it comes to Fortune My Foe, Tomkins uses the double stroke exclusively, with one exception where he writes a triple stroke, a fairly rare sign in general, which we are also unsure of its meaning. Now, one could point out that since this piece was written in 1654, we're getting towards the latter half of the 17th century, and therefore the double stroke could be interpreted as a more standard Baroque trill starting on the upper note. However, it is important to keep in mind that when Tomkins wrote this piece, he was 82 years old, so that his own practice could reflect an older tradition. We also have to consider whether he really had in mind only one particular ornament for the entire piece, or whether the double stroke simply stands as a generic sign for adding an ornament appropriate to the context. After mentioning all of these different options, it may come as a surprise that I have decided to interpret the vast majority of double strokes as trills, with only a few exceptions where I play mordents. In other words, what I'm doing is this, and let me demonstrate by playing the first two measures of the opening of the piece. So for the first double stroke, which is this one here, I'm playing a simple mordent. And then for the second one, this one here, I'm playing a trill. And in terms of trills, I start all of them on the upper note. This in no way reflects what I would do in a different piece, but here, starting a trill on the principal note simply did not sound right to me. And I should stress here the words "to me." There is nothing objective about my decision. It's simply that I feel this particular piece seems to call for little dissonant sparks rather than confirmations of the melodic contour. The last aspect of performance I would like to address concerns the choice of tempo. When it comes to deciding whether a piece is difficult or easy to perform, it is fair to say that the majority of listeners, and unfortunately in my opinion, also a significant number of musicians, think primarily of the technical rather than the interpretive challenges. I tend to think the opposite way because I find mastering technique is far easier than mastering how to play expressively, but that's perhaps a topic for another video. Seen from the standpoint of technique, Fortune My Foe is not particularly difficult. Basically, the fastest passages are nothing more than scalar runs that resemble diatonic scale passages, and I say resemble because the piece does not exactly follow the conventions of major-minor tonality. And to make things easier, these runs mostly involve the natural keys. This means that any keyboard player brought up with later repertory from the 18th and particularly the 19th and 20th centuries can probably go to town playing these scalar passages at an extremely fast tempo, which may produce a temporary rush of adrenaline to both performer and listener, but which, in my opinion at least, may not necessarily have much musical value. What I think is actually more difficult from a performance standpoint is to find ways to make these runs expressively meaningful and also try to give them individual characters, something that will transform the piece from a superficial etude to a multi-layered and deeply felt composition. Of course, one way of giving these runs more character is to explore the option of using historical fingerings, but this is also a multifaceted subject that requires a video of its own. For those unfamiliar with historical fingerings, let me briefly point out that they can be fundamentally different to modern fingering, and one of the main differences has to do with how we negotiate playing extended scalar passages. With modern fingering, we use the thumb as a means of extending our range of available fingers. Historical fingerings, by contrast, will often employ a pair of fingers to go either up or down the scale. Hence, you will also hear the expression paired fingering. This is a very brief demo just to give you an idea of the difference. So I am still looking at the second variation, and towards the end of the second variation, we have certain scalar passages in the right hand. I'm only showing you the right hand right now, but something similar can happen also with the left hand. Let me try to play it with mostly modern fingering. And now I want to do this with historical fingering. There is more than one option, by the way, but I will just show you what I tend to do. And what I want to do also is to really slow it down and kind of exaggerate it a little bit so that it is obvious that you can see it. So it can work a lot more smoothly than this. So this is just a exaggerated demonstration. So what I would do is this. I can start the same way, but once I reach the second finger here, then I go back to the third finger. So you notice that I'm actually going down these scalar passages, mostly using the pair 3-2. And then if I'm going to go up, I'm actually going to use the pairs 3 and 4. And then I make it a little more conventional at the end. So very, very brief demonstration of how this may work. If you haven't had a chance to work with historical fingerings, I should add that with practice, you can actually play quite fast and even smoothly. But to me, what is so valuable is that using them opens up different possibilities of articulation. But what is arguably even more fundamental concerns how you think of these scalar passages or how you approach them. And what is crucial here is to not treat all of the notes in a scalar passage equally. There are many ways of doing this, and I've addressed this topic in previous videos. So here I want to briefly mention some of the possibilities, and then you can hear how these are applied in my performance. One possibility is to linger a little longer on the first note of a scalar passage or selected notes within a passage. And you can linger in terms of allowing a note to have a slightly longer value or hold it a little longer while you play the next couple of notes. Or you could do both of these things at the same time. You can also use very slight tempo modifications, like for instance, gradually and subtly speeding up during the course of playing a scalar passage. Another way is to vary the articulation in different ways. If, for instance, we think of paired fingerings, we could do something along the lines of strong, weak pairs of notes. And I did this a little bit when I was demonstrating, and basically what it means is we can think of the third finger as a strong finger, and it usually ends up being on a more important part of the beat. And then the second finger, if we're going down the scale, as a little less important. And the same thing when we go up, then we think of the fourth finger as a little less important. Once again, I'm exaggerating the effect. It doesn't have to be like this, but the idea is to be thinking about it, and then depending on the context, you can make it a little more or a little less of a strong weak pair. But once again, this is simply one of the different ways that you can use varied articulation. As always, thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoy the performance.